Hello and welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. This is a podcast to help you find peace with food and overcome disordered eating. And I'm Harriet Frew, aka the Eating Disorder Therapist. And I'm so excited to share with you all kinds of stories, tips, information and guest interviews to help you on your journey in finding peace with food. So thank you so much for listening today. Now today I want to talk all about restrictive eating. Okay, so this is something that I find is so common in working with many of my clients, whatever eating disorder or disordered eating they are struggling with. And I guess often people are displaying other disordered eating behaviors, things like binge eating, preoccupation with food, chewing and spitting, feeling physically exhausted and undernourished, probably as symptoms related to the restrictive eating. However, often my clients don't consider themselves to actually be restricting food. So I think what often happens here is most people will have a phase of their life that they look back on where they feel like, well, that's when I was really restricting. They might have had a phase where they were on an extreme diet, eating very few calories, being kind of ultra strict and rigid and following a plan to the letter. And they look back and they think, well, that is when I was truly restricting my eating. What I'm doing today isn't really the same. I'm not restricting. So what I want to talk about today is some of the little hidden ways, hidden and maybe not so hidden ways that we can sometimes con ourselves. I think that we're not restricting our eating. And I guess the purpose of this is just to shine a light on this in a really caring, compassionate way, because I think if you can recognize where you have little bits of restrictive eating going on, it can help you to make some little shifts and it can help you to move more towards recovery, and it's going to have an impact on your other eating disordered eating behaviors. And I know for myself, my own recovery, this was true for me, that I continued to be a bit restrictive with my eating, and it left me in a place where I couldn't quite recover from bulimia. I would often go sort of like 10 days without binging and purging and thinking, I'm really getting on top of this. I'm really kind of starting to come out the other side of this. I'm sure that I'm going to fully recover soon. But actually the thing that was holding me back, as well as obviously using bulimia as a coping strategy to deal with my emotions, etc. But a significant thing was that I was still just being a bit too restrictive. So I was trying to be like too good with my eating, probably like eliminating carbs, not just quite eating enough, avoiding certain foods. And I could do this for so long and it wouldn't last, and then I'd end up back in the cycle again. So let's talk about some different signs that you might be restricting your eating, and I'm going to talk about 10 different ones. But actually, before I launch into that, I'm going to talk about some signs that you might be restricting your eating. So first of all, see if you relate to any of these things that I'm going to talk about. So number one, you are preoccupied with food a large amount of the time. So perhaps you're thinking about food a lot, even though you're not always actually eating it. You're thinking about your next meal, you're thinking about what you've just eaten, you're thinking about, what you're going to eat next week. It's always kind of like these thoughts are there in your mind constantly. Number two, you find yourself getting extremely hungry at certain times. And then actually in that moment, then it's really hard not to overeat, maybe binge eat, perhaps fall into chewing or spitting. You kind of reach that level of what I would call ferocious hunger. And I think for many people, this might be particularly true for late afternoon, evening time. I think it's quite common sometimes that people are quite restrictive in the earlier part of the day. But then as the day goes on, we get more tired, we get more hungry. We don't have as much willpower, we're not feeling so resilient, the day has worn us down, and we're hugely vulnerable then. If we become over hungry, we can easily fall into kind of overeating, binge eating, chewing and spitting, etc. And I guess your poor body doesn't want to feel hungry or feel restricted or restrained. And just as our ancestors would have feasted after the famine, your instinct after depriving yourself will be to eat and compensate for the previous lack. As human beings, we are designed for survival. Number three, you find it hard to focus on daily tasks due to food preoccupation. So if you find that you are trying to work, but you are constantly thinking about food. Maybe you're constantly feeling a bit irritable, a bit tired, a bit that you can't focus and be in the moment. Maybe you're going through to the kitchen if you're working from home and you're opening the cupboard door and looking at the food even though you're not eating it. So this is probably a sign that you're restricting your eating. Number 4, you try to distract yourself from hunger by being busy. So you might be doing like extra cleaning or going for a walk or occupying yourself with tasks that you feel are going to distract you when actually you are really actually genuinely hungry. Number 5, so you're exercising to distract or try and numb your hunger. So maybe you're actively going to the gym or you are doing a workout when you know you're hungry, but actually you're trying to kind of delay eating and distract yourself. Number 6, you are tired, weary and distracted. So even just like doing the daily tasks feels exhausting, feels overwhelming. And perhaps when you even think about walking up the stairs, you just haven't got any fuel in the tank. These could all be signs that you're restricting. So I guess there are many more things that I could talk about, but I thought those are some of the things that are kind of quite common and things that you may relate to. But you might find your symptoms expand beyond those things I've just talked about. Okay, so let's explore 10 ways that you might be restricting your eating and look at those. So number 1, I guess the obvious one is the good old calorie controlled plan. So we often think about restrictive eating, don't we, as following the calorie controlled diet, the traditional plan where you're trying to limit your intake to a certain number of calories per day. And we know that many of these online kind of diets and things that are promoted are basically encouraging you to eat about the same amount of food as a toddler would need to eat in the day. So they're usually very restrictive. So if you're following the calorie controlled plan, you're likely fixating on that number, which is probably too low for what your body needs. You're probably putting that information maybe into something like MyFitnessPal. You're kind of tracking, counting up all the different numbers, and you're not really listening to your body. You are not listening to your hunger. You're not listening to what your body needs. You are following this external plan and trying to stay within the limit. So I guess number 1, the calorie control plan, that is quite an obvious method of restriction. Number 2, delaying eating. Now, this is very, very common. And to illustrate this, let's talk about my fictional client, Jane. So Jane would miss breakfast to delay eating as long as possible. She would then push back lunch in an attempt to reduce the amount of food eaten over the day. So she'd probably not be eating lunch till 2 or 3. Then she might be pushing back dinner until 9 if she could make it through. So really just delaying eating, trying to push back eating further and further into the day because there's the real fear that if I start eating, I won't be able to stop. And there's this real feeling as well about wanting to save calories. Now, I think this is a very, very common trap that many, many people with eating disorders and disordered eating fall into, delaying eating, and it often ends up in people getting really over hungry and then falling into things like binge eating and things later on in the day because actually the body is just starving for fuel. Okay, number 3, eliminating food groups. So maybe thinking carbs are the enemy. I must eat 100% clean. So we know the good old wellness movement where we're often encouraged not to eat gluten or dairy, eliminate carbohydrates, eliminate so many different food groups in the name of kind of health and looking after ourselves. But, often this has gone to a really, really extreme level and you're probably existing on protein and vegetables and not much else. So it is so common. People that often binge eat have been following a diet that has banned certain food groups. And I think it's really, really common as well. If we're not eating enough carbohydrates, we often get really, really hungry because our brain just wants that glucose. It wants that fuel. And also getting the yum yum factor from eating. If we're just eating protein and vegetables, we're often not truly feeling satisfied, satiated, that we've really had the yum yum factor from our food. So even if you're eating volumes and volumes of vegetables and protein, you might just still not really feel satisfied. So my fictional client Emma started out with healthy eating, and then her diet became more and more extreme, reduced to protein shakes, vegetables, fruit, and not a lot else. She wasn't eating enough healthy fats or carbs, and she basically developed orthorexia, being obsessed on an unhealthy level by trying to eat clean, and her life became extremely restricted. Okay, so if you recognize yourself here, if you're cutting out food groups in an extreme way, this is restrictive eating. Now, obviously, there's a caveat to this. If you are celiac, if you have a genuine food intolerance, you may need to cut out some food groups to manage your health. But for most people listening to this, that is not going to be true. And we know that cutting out food groups in an extreme way often leads to eating disorders and disordered eating. Okay, number 4. So if you are chewing gum to avoid eating, this is absolutely a form of restriction. And I think talking about it here, it can seem fairly obvious, can't it? But I think, you might be in a pattern of doing this yourself, but not have really recognized it as restriction. So I've worked with several clients who will go through packets and packets of chewing gum over the course of a week as a food replacement in inverted commas. So this is absolutely a form of restriction. I think as well what tends to happen with people is, with chewing gum, some chewing gums as well have kind of stimulants in them. I think in the short term, they may override your appetite, help you delay eating. And what tends to happen is it catches up with you, you get over hungry later in the day, and then you can be really, really vulnerable to binge eating and other disordered eating behaviours. Number 5, time restrictive eating or intermittent fasting. Now, time restrictive eating is very much the rage right now and is promoted on many credible podcasts and in the media. Now, I think it's important to say here that I'm not saying time restrictive eating or intermittent fasting is terrible for every single person on the planet. Okay, I think some people can do it in an effective way. They don't actually restrict their food, and actually they have a healthy relationship with food and it seems to work for them. However, there's a big however. For anyone struggling with disordered eating, eating disorders, time restrictive eating can be a hugely detrimental practice. And I think particularly if you're trying to cram all your eating within a 4-hour window, a 6-hour window, or something very restrictive like that, it's really, really not very helpful. And I find as well that so many of my clients will use time restrictive eating as a way to limit their calories more. So what tends to happen is, I guess in official time restrictive eating, you're not really meant to be limiting the amount you eat overall. You're just kind of limiting your eating to within a time window. So you're still eating the same amount, but you're having it all within that window of time. Whereas I think many people with eating disorders, disordered eating, actually just use this as another way to restrict. And then actually they're not getting enough calories, not getting enough energy. They become ferociously hungry as a result. And then the other disordered eating behaviours really kick in, the binge eating, etc. So as I've said, I'm sure some people in the world thrive on this practice, and there is value, possibly some value as well, in giving your body a rest from always digesting food. But I think, actually for most of us, we do that anyway. I tend to think I probably eat my last bit of food around 7 o'clock in the evening. I'm probably not having my breakfast till 6, 7 in the morning. So I'm kind of having that whole window of giving my body a rest from eating. Eating disorder recovery though, regular eating is really, really helpful. Not helpful to be trying to do time restrictive eating and putting yourself in that deprived place. Number 6, filling up on fluids, maybe water, Coke, tea, coffee. So if you're filling up on fluids to stave off hunger cues, this is restrictive eating. And many of my clients as well will drink copious amounts of Diet Coke, Coke Zero, cups of tea, cups of coffee, water, anything just to kind of fill up and try to override those hunger cues. And this is really quite disruptive for the body as well, because you almost get used to feeling kind of very full, but you're not really satisfied. But it can be quite disruptive to your hunger and fullness cues, because actually you start to get this kind of artificial feeling of fullness from always filling up with liquid. So again, not very helpful. and can really be very disruptive to trying to establish a more healthy, regular eating pattern. Okay, time for a short advertisement break. Have you had a lifelong struggle with your weight and gone down the surgery route? Have you been caught in the diet cycle, losing and gaining the same weight repeatedly, and perhaps you pinned all of your hopes on bariatric surgery, but only to realise that head hunger, food noise and emotional eating have returned along with a fear of weight gain? You are not alone on the Gastric Mindset podcast. Safi shares real-life stories from people who have had weight loss surgery, and she interviews experts to help you understand the deep-rooted psychological and behavioural aspects that make it achievable to find long-term weight loss success. Safi is 8 years post-op and a therapeutic practitioner who is passionate about making psychological support accessible to all. The Gastric Mindset podcast is out every Friday and can be found on all major podcast platforms, link in the show notes. Number 7, exercising or being busy instead of eating. So if you're exercising to avoid eating or doing extra cleaning tasks or things to distract yourself from food and you are hungry, this is restrictive eating. Now, short term, this may work to stave off hunger and distract, but ultimately that hunger is going to catch up with you later and you're probably going to feel really out of control and over hungry, and it might lead to episodes of overeating or just feeling really miserable and deprived and hungry. Number 8, avoiding social eating. So you might be restricting your life severely to keep within your food rules. You might avoid any socializing or eating out with friends as you don't want to spoil your perfect eating plan. And you might feel that you have to be completely in control of preparing your own food, as otherwise you'll feel terrified about what others might put into your meals. But this leaves you in a very restrictive and deprived place because you are missing out on so much of life, and it's another form of restrictive eating. Number 9, taking diet pills to stave off hunger. So diet pills, very sadly, are prescribed quite freely over the internet and even face-to-face, and they can be quite addictive, and they are really, I consider, to be part of a money-making industry, weight loss industry that exploits us rather than genuinely being concerned about health. And I know some of my clients who have fallen into a place where they feel very dependent on diet pills, and actually they shouldn't be being prescribed these diet pills. They are pills that sometimes are recommended if someone is extremely overweight and for a short period of time, but a lot of my clients, or I should say some of my clients, are using these as weight loss tool when they shouldn't be, and actually this is actually quite dangerous. Often these diet pills are putting our nervous systems into a very sort of sympathetic, stimulated state. We don't really always know what the effect of long-term use is, and actually then when you finally come off them, you're probably going to feel pretty low, depressed, anxious, lacking in energy. They are not great at all. Okay. And obviously just having a dependency and an addiction, which can be like a mental and a physical thing around using these, is extremely unhelpful, and absolutely it is a form of restriction. And number 10, talking about mental restriction. So with mental restriction, although you may not be actively restricting, so for example, if you're mentally restricting, you might still be kind of having some cake or chocolate or bread or whatever it is that you feel that you should have been avoiding in the past when you were dieting. So you might be kind of eating these foods. However, your thoughts and feelings about food and body image are still very much aligned with someone who is dieting. So say, for example, even if you are eating the biscuits mid-afternoon, you're probably feeling a lot of guilt, shame, and anxiety around eating. So mentally and emotionally, you're not feeling peace with food. And you're certainly not giving yourself 100% permission to enjoy these foods. So mental restriction brings consistent stress around eating. And there are probably quite a few sneaky rules or rigid thought patterns lurking beneath this. So if you are mentally restricting, you might eat a biscuit or something and then think, I can't possibly still be hungry, I've just eaten, so I must have just eaten this for emotional reasons. Or you might think, I shouldn't be eating this. This is such an unhealthy choice. I'm greedy and out of control for eating this. So you can see when you're thinking about food in this way, it's going to make you feel very stressed. It's going to make you much more vulnerable to disordered eating behaviors like binge eating, because of you are going to activate that I've blown it effect because of the way you're talking to yourself. It's just not a healthy way to be in a relationship with food, potentially very damaging. Okay, so that's my whistle-stop tour of 10 ways that you might be restricting, and I'm going to just talk briefly about what you can do instead if you recognize yourself here. So if you recognize you're restricting your eating, what can you do about it? Okay, well, I guess firstly, it's just really helpful to recognize that you're doing it and that it is a problem, okay? Because this in itself is a powerful shift in your consciousness, and it raises your awareness and consideration around change, okay? So maybe that is all you can do right now. You might be feeling, actually, I'm not really ready to give up restriction yet, but just to acknowledge that you're doing it and that potentially it could be quite unhelpful is a helpful first step. Next thing you could do as well is really write down your pros and cons of restrictive eating. Is it really serving you? And just get honest with yourself here, because of course, in the short term, when you're restricting your eating, you might feel more in control. You might feel that you're managing your weight. You might feel that you are doing something well. You might feel that it's protecting you from feeling difficult feelings. It's probably serving a purpose for you. However, it's probably really impacting you physically in terms of your energy, your ability to concentrate. It's probably really impacting you emotionally, the effect on your kind of relationships, how much you're able to engage and be in the moment in life. It's probably really impacting your social life, just being able to kind of go out and be spontaneous and do all the things that you want to do to lead your best life. So do a list of your pros and cons. That can be such a helpful exercise, because again, it helps you explore your ambivalence around change and really recognize kind of like, okay, I can understand now why restrictive eating is kind of serving me in inverted commas, but also I can really recognize how it is not serving me, and that can just give you a bit of impetus around change. Okay, now if you're really feeling, actually, I want to start making some change here, what the most helpful thing to do if you recognize that you're in a restrictive eating pattern is work towards adopting regular eating pattern to help stabilize your blood sugar. Because what dieting tends to do, whatever form of restrictive eating you're doing, it tends to lower your blood sugar. You then get these kind of ferocious cravings for food, and then it just really leads you to a place where it's really hard not to binge eat, chew and spit, etc. So with regular eating, what we're trying to do is work towards eating 3 meals and 3 snacks per day, spreading these out at regular intervals. Now, if this just feels way too overwhelming for you, don't worry, just start where you're at, okay? So maybe think about where in the day could I start to implement regular eating, and you just start there and you start to build on that, okay? So it might be just start with breakfast initially, and then you can work up from there. You don't have to do it all at once. And what you want to be doing as well when you're doing regular eating is starting to include all the food groups. So particularly at your main meals, you want to be having some protein, some fats and some carbohydrates, so that your body has a chance to be satiated and that your blood sugar is stabilized. And honestly, this is such a game changer if you really want to reduce things like binge eating, chewing and spitting, feeling out of control around food. Regular eating will help you form such a stable base and will help you to then be able to work much better on your emotional triggers. Because if you haven't got stable body physiology, you are so vulnerable. You're not going to be able to work on your emotional triggers because you're already going to be feeling hangry, tired, irritable, emotionally dysregulated from lack of food. And then of course you're going to have no resilience to deal with your emotional triggers. So regular eating is not the cure for an eating disorder, but it's a massive, massive important block of change in the whole process. Now, I remember, I told you on this podcast before, when I first began to eat regularly after months of dieting, it was in fact actually just such a relief to be able to respond to hunger and to actually feel a sense of satisfaction and fullness from eating rather than always running on empty. And, I'm not saying it was all done of rainbows and unicorns by any means. There were lots of challenges that came with this as well, but actually just knowing that I had safe times that I could eat during the day and that I was going to be fueled, it really did help me to get a bit of a kind of handle on my binge eating and to reduce that. And the next thing as well, once you feel that you are a bit more in a pattern with your regular eating, and I think this has to come first before you feel that you can move on to the next step. But the next step is to start to think about reintroducing very gradually your old forbidden foods back in to your dietary regime, one food at a time. Because as we all know, if you completely ban certain foods, see them as naughty or forbidden, you're going to want to eat them more. They're going to be the foods that you dream about, that you put on a pedestal, that you idolize, that you're kind of craving, the things that you kind of wake up in the night and dream about. So short term, of course, you're going to feel terrified of doing this. You're going to think, oh my goodness, if I start eating donuts, I'm never going to be able to stop. I'm just going to keep eating them all day long and terrible things are going to happen. And it is a natural backlash in the beginning that when you have been restricting your eating, when you start to reintroduce the old foods, you will feel a sense of wanting to eat. Lots of them, it will feel a bit out of control, it will feel a bit unsafe. It's such an important step to do in recovery though. It's something we can't really avoid because of the more you try and avoid those foods, one day it's all gonna catch up with you and you're probably gonna have a big binge or lose control around eating them. But when you're ready to reintroduce your forbidden foods, you can do it really slowly, one food at a time, doing it in controlled portions. Initially you might have to do it when you're out in a cafe, when you're with a friend, when you know in a way that you are in a kind of much safer place psychologically. So it can be done in a very step way, and I've got kind of other podcasts which go into more detail about how to reintroduce forbidden foods. Okay, so I hope you have found this podcast helpful. If you're not following me already on Instagram, do seek me out at the Eating Disorder Therapist _ For further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. You might be interested in my online course, 10 Steps Towards Intuitive Eating. There's currently 50% off this course with the code FREEDOMISPOSSIBLE. You can find information about that either in the show notes or at the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.